Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. And my name is Eric. And I have a guest with me, Ethan Jago, who is a good buddy of mine. I've known him for years. We were military buddies back in the day, and he's now a pastor. Ethan, how you doing?
Doing good, man. Thanks for having me on. I think last time me and you were physically together, was that in Key West?
It was. I think you caught a shark.
I did. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was
a lot of fun. I've not been back there since.
Oh, it's a great place. But the reason I wanted to have Ethan on, former military guy who's now a pastor, he wrote a blog post that really spoke to me because one of the biggest questions I've had, I would say paradigm shifts I've had in the last 3 years is, what is a Christian's role in government and society when they see either a trend towards something bad or something bad? And you can't always pin the tail on the donkey and say, this is word for word unbiblical, not allowed. But you might think, okay, this leads to something really bad, human suffering, etc. So I wanted to get into that. He has an awesome blog. I'll link it in the description. Battlefield Theologian. I wanted to get into specifically what he wrote in there. And you pastor, if I'm not mistaken, down in Florida. Is that correct?
Yeah, Panama City Beach.
Awesome. What's your church's name?
Five Bridges Church. Okay. So if you're ever in the area, come visit.
And people can follow you on, I follow a lot of what he says on social media, but are you Battlefield Theologian on Instagram as well?
No, I'm Ethan Jago on Instagram, Battlefield Theologian on YouTube, and Twitter, Ethan Jago 3, because I lost my login for the first Ethan Jago, so I lost it.
Dude, you're a family man. I get it.
Yeah.
So he writes right at the top, should Christians rebel? And this has been my question the last 3 years is like, what is our role in tyranny? And where do we as Christians step in? And again, I'll link this whole article if you guys want to read it. But I wanted to get in specifically what he talks about in relation to Christian nationalism, Ethan. You said here, similar to what transpired then, some aspects of Christian nationalism echo the same mentality as that of the German peasant revolt. So first I wanted to ask, what is your definition? Because that's one thing I hear a lot online or on Twitter. I read about Christian nationalism, and I don't really know, like Christian, if you isolate the words, and nationalism, national pride. But how do you define Christian nationalism?
So like you said, Eric, there is a myriad of different definitions of what that means, and it all depends on the individual that you're asking. Essentially, what I have boiled this down to is that the person's definition, or at least working definition of what Christian nationalism is, depends on what's known as eschatology, or their view of the end times, about, what is going to happen at the very end. And for Christians, it's, we know that Christ is coming back a second time. Well, the three main viewpoints on that is that the Christians will be raptured into heaven with Christ before the millennium reign, or then that's the pre-mill. Then there's the a-mill, that Christ is currently reigning, and then there's the post-mill, whereas that we are to usher in Christ's second return, and that things will inherently get better and better and better until we get to that point of Christ coming back and establishing the throne. So that's post-millennialism. So when you think about it that way, you have to view like Christian nationalism's definition is going to be coming from the different individuals' and times worldview. So when you think about Christian nationalism, like you already did, you parse the word out. Christian, obviously, you know what that means. And then nationalism is essentially establishing, and this is going to be the definition that I've been seeing most often being used, is it's a Christian nation. So a theocratic society that is ruled and governed by God. So if you've ever read the Old Testament, it's going to be very referenced back to that, where the people of Israel, they had a spokesperson, for instance, Moses, but ultimately it was ruled and governed by God. And with that too, then there came a bunch of different laws, ceremonies, and stuff like that the Israelites were supposed to do unto Yahweh, sacrifices, Mosaic ceremonial laws, and stuff like that. So the way I see Christian nationalism being defined today is that Christians need to take back the government sphere. We need to establish a Christian, like a true Christian, quote unquote, president, Christian government, where the entire nation of America is being governed by scriptural morality, truth, and ethics, and should be enforceable too for those who violate the Christian morality, law, and ethics as well. And that is like the easiest summation I can do. And there's a lot, that's a very simplified definition because there's a ton more that goes into that. And some people listening may even say, well, that's not my definition. Of course it's not. Like it varies from person to person, but I would say that's the largest viewpoint of what people are deeming to be Christian nationalism, is taking back the governmental spheres. And what they say too is like, we've got to take back, the civil magistrates, we've got to take back the education system, we've got to take back the political, all those different environments, social, economical kind of stuff, to take it back and establish Christian principles and doctrine. Now, here's the issue that I have with this is not the first time that this is like something like this has happened. If you go back into church history, which I love church history, in 313 AD, Constantine ended the 250 years of Christian persecution. So Christian persecution started at 64 AD with Emperor Nero, and then it continued on for 250 years. Then in 313, Emperor Constantine, which I think we all know who Constantine, or at least have heard of him, he established the Pax Romana, meaning the peace of Rome, basically barring any more executions and persecutions of Christians. Well, who followed him, though, is a man named Theodosius the Great. And Theodosius the Great established Christianity as the national religion for Rome. And what happened with that is everyone now in the Roman Empire was to convert to Christianity. And so you're telling people who are polytheistic, who believed in Zeus and all of these other gods, hey, now you need to be Christian. So you can't be worshiping Zeus. You can't be worshiping Aphrodite. You can't be worshiping all these other people. So what they did is they equivocated those terms. They equivocated those names where, Zeus became Jesus or God the Father. And then Ares became this, and so forth and so on, through the pantheon of gods was really still the same gods that they were worshiping. They just now gave them Christian names. And out of Theodosius the Great, this is when Roman Catholic tradition really started to come rise, with the veneration of icons and memorializing of saints and relics and everything else like that. And so the reason why I push back on Christian nationalism is because historically we can look back as to when this happened and the perversion that happened all the way in the 4th century that came to kind of like its culmination in the Great Schism between the Eastern and the Western Church. And then again in 1517 with the Protestant Reformation out of and from the Roman Catholic Church, bringing us back to biblical Christianity. So when you think about Christian nationalism, think establishing and making and enforcing Christianity as the national religion. So whether you are truly a person who believes in Jesus or not, by default now, if you're born in America, you are now deemed a Christian. You will have to undergo a Christian baptism, Christian practice, which I think that is just ridiculous. You cannot enforce Christian ethics, laws, and morality and expect people to practice as a Christian when they're not a Christian. And so with that, you're just going to get a distortion of true biblical Christianity because these are individuals who have not accepted Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. They have just now said that, yes, I am now identifying as a Christian. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. That's kind of like my historical approach to helping me define what Christian nationalism is and how it's not worked in the past.
Yeah, I think that because that's been one of my, that makes sense to me. Like a theocracy, we all know what the Roman Catholic Church used to do, and a government run by man under the Bible can be distorted and used at their will. And but one of the questions I had about that, and I agree with majority, actually all of what you said, except like when it comes to, and I'm sure you would agree with this, Christians taking back culture, because some people would argue with you. It's like, no, we're not trying to make Christian laws like making, well, we're not trying to make cheating on your wife illegal. We're trying to make abortion illegal, or we're trying to make things that are morally incorrect, but we're not trying to inject Christian morality into law on every law. But there's a gauge there, I guess. They do want Christian morality in abortion laws, but not necessarily making cheating on your wife or infidelity illegal. So where do you draw the line when because a lot of people would say, including me, there, and I've realized this to some degree, there isn't any neutrality. So to say we don't want Christian laws here, quote unquote Christian laws, then what will it be? Instead, it will be, if it's not based off the Bible, what will it be based off of? And to that extent, wouldn't it be something that's far worse and potentially way more immoral if it's not based off of a higher authority? How am I making sense there?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because in one instance, what I'm saying is that I don't think we need to establish Christianity as a national religion. But in the other instance, I would say that Christianity definitely needs to impact and influence the culture rather than Christianity be influenced and impacted by the culture. In what you said, I mean, if the culture could adhere to, or at least follow, a Christian set of morals and values, inherently the society will get better. But the biggest thing with that, to say and caveat and to fight for pro-life, 100%, like that's without a doubt. We need Christians in the political sphere. I'm not saying Christians should not or could not be in the political sphere. They need to be. But if I'm trying to get into the political sphere of establishing Christianity as the national religion to make everybody Christian, in an ideal society, great, that'd be awesome, but that's not going to be the case. We know that not everyone is going to accept Christ. We know that not everyone is going to be in heaven with Christ, because if you reject him, you won't be. And we know that narrow is the gate, and few who find it, and wide is the gate and the path to destruction. So even Jesus says, like, not many people are going to come. And then even too in Matthew 7:21, he says, many will come to me in that day and will say, Lord, Lord, did we not do this, this, and this in your name? And he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. So we know very clearly not everyone is going to heaven. That would be a universalist view of, like, it doesn't matter what you believe or how you believe, you'll all get there. But what you have to understand is that we as Christians, we are given biblical examples, and not just us as Christians, but as mankind, about how we should view each other as man. So we were in Genesis 1, when God created the heavens and the earth, and he created male and female, he made man and women in the image of God. So we are the image bearers. So since we are the image bearers, that means that there is a sanctity of life that Christians and humankind, regardless of what you believe in, that you are supposed to adhere to, adopt, and protect human life. That's why, like, when people grow up, you don't have to be taught Christian morals. They're kind of baked into you, and the Bible attests to that. The law of God is written on their hearts. Even though they do not acknowledge God, they acknowledge him, that he exists by a way in which they act. Because when you were born, no one said, hey, Eric, by the way, when you go to school, don't murder anybody. You know, it's kind of ingrained into the human psyche about what is and is not acceptable and what we should or should not do. That's the inherent right and wrong. And so that's the objective standard that we all understand to be true. But like you said, there has to be an objective standard outside of ourselves. And that objective standard is the scriptures, because that was divinely inspired. It's the written word of God. And that is what dictates and governs our rule and functionality in life. But now when you apply this to the government, Romans 13, and there's several other passages too, that alludes to what is the role of government and how is a Christian supposed to rule, how the Christian is supposed to relate to government. But there's requirements too of what the government should and should not do. For instance, one of the things is that when in Deuteronomy, and I've got the passages here as well. Let me get my mouse working here. In Deuteronomy, God commands us, and commands specifically the leaders, but not just the leaders, but all mankind, to protect human life. Because life is precious. We're all made in the image and likeness of God. We are supposed to be bearing his image, and we are not to taint or tarnish the image of any other image bearer, because they also bear that same image. And in Micah 6:8, it says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do justice. So we're given the explicit command of do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. The word justice in the context of Micah 6:8 is saying, and is meaning literally what it quite means from the Hebrew, is to act in accordance with divine law, to enact judgment or deciding a case. And then later on in Deuteronomy, we are given the explicit command that we are supposed to have civil magistrates over top of us to enforce the protection of human life. And in Deuteronomy 16:18, it says, you shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your gates of the towns, which Yahweh your God is giving you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So we're now given a quality and a qualifying standpoint that the judgment is supposed to be righteous. Where they land that righteous judgment, it should be from scripture, but we know that's not always the case. And then verse 19, you shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. So the word judges in verse 18 of Deuteronomy 16, that word judges is referring to civil officers, which is in in reference to what they were supposed to be doing, is given the task of rendering judgments and administering justice. And then this is where kind of like, if you will, for corporate punishment comes in Genesis 9:5-6. This is all supposed to be done on the governmental level. In Genesis 9:5-6, it says, surely I will require your lifeblood from every living thing. I will require it. And from every man, from each man's brother, I will require the life of the man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So what this is meaning is that punishment from the hand of every man who sheds blood. That means it is required to seek, to ask for, to exact that the punishment of taking another person's life should and will result in your life being taken from you, whether that's the right here and now through the government, if they're actually doing what they're supposed to do, or that's from God eventually, in which he will take you home, or you'll be spending eternity, in hell or whatever else. And then finally, what it is that we are supposed to be viewing, once we've got kind of the view of what man's role is, how does God view man? How should man view each other? What should the government do? What should we be doing with Christian morality, practices, ethics, and laws? We have to understand that the government has been duly appointed by God to be in that position, whether you like the candidate or not, because God is sovereign, meaning God is in control of everything, that God has allowed these rulers to be in the positions that they're at. And you may think, why would he do that? I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and question God. He's God. He knows everything. So I just need to accept it. I don't have to like it. I just need to know that God has allowed this government regime, or whomever it is, or this president or this monarchy, he has allowed that to come up into power for whatever purpose and reason. But if they violate that purpose and reason and what they are supposed to be doing, such as protecting human life, enforcing strict laws, and making it seem inhospitable for those who take human life, then that government is supposed to protect that. But then if they're not doing that, now they're in violations of God's law, and they are now deemed, if you will, a farce, if, for lack of better terms. They're a non God adhering, biblical adhering government that is doing and operating what they should be doing. And in Romans 13:1-7, I'll end with this so you can give me some feedback here. This gives us the mandate for Christians, regardless of how we feel about the government, regardless how we feel about the situation, wherever we're at. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those who exist have been appointed by God. So this is Paul, and he's writing this in prison, and he is saying that we are to be subject to the governing authorities, because no authority has been put into that position unless God has allowed them and have appointed them to be there. And then in verse 2, it says, therefore, whoever resists that authority has opposed the ordinance of God. Meaning, if you deny your government, if you disobey your government, that means you're now essentially not just rebelling against that government, you're rebelling against God. And they have, who fear the oppressed, opposed, will receive condemnation upon themselves. Meaning that if you disobey the government, you will receive condemnation, not just from that government, right? You break a law of the government that the government has exacted, you will not only receive condemnation from that government, prison, whatever, but same thing from God. Now, there's caveats to this, which I'll explain here in a second. But verse 3 kind of gives us more of a dictation of what a government should and should not be. Verse 3 says, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. So if you do what's right, you shouldn't get in trouble. There should be no fear. Do what's right, you're good. But for evil. So rulers should cause evildoers fear that if I mess up, or if I do something that's against the law, I'm going to be held accountable because that government's going to enact justice on me. Sadly, that's not the case right now. And then it says this, do you want to have no fear for that authority? Then do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword in vain, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So what this is saying is Christians do not rebel against the government because the government passes a rule or a law that you don't like. Now, the government can violate God's ordinance and God's law by not upholding justice, by encouraging evildoers to continue doing evil, by not protecting life. But then also, too, if the government oversteps and they tell Christians to do something that God commands, or they forbid Christians, or they forbid Christians from doing something that God commands, or they command us to do something that God forbids, right? So if they're telling us, hey, you can't go to church, but God commands us to go to church, I don't need to listen to that law. But if they're saying that, hey, we are commanding you to bow the knee to the president and to worship him as God, like what had happened with the Caesars in the time of Rome. And if you go even to the Old Testament, if people are not knowing a lot about the Bible, You've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You've got Daniel in the lion's den, those guys who refused to bend the knee and honor this King Nebuchadnezzar as God. So if they're commanding us to do something that God forbids, or if they're forbidding us to do something that God commands, I do not need to obey, not the entirety of the government, but that specific ordinance and law. When COVID happened, a lot of the governments were saying you can't go to church. Okay. At the outset of that, I see why a lot of churches, respected that, because, hey, they wanted to protect their people. They were following the guidance of the law. But then after a while, when they realized, okay, this isn't clearing up, the death rate isn't nearly as high as we thought it was. We are commanded to gather together. There's nothing in the Bible in the section in Hebrews that says, do not neglect the gathering of believers as many have made it a habit to. It doesn't say as long as it's comfortable, as long as it's acceptable. There's Christians in countries right now that are denied access territories, if you will, for Christians to live in, that if they get caught preaching, they're going to get killed. Even though it's banned in that country, they're still doing it, and as they should do it, because God commands them to continue to teach and to spread the gospel. So I'll wrap it up with that, saying, like, there's points in delineations and clear lines that if the government crosses, the Christians do not have to obey that specific law. But that doesn't mean that the entirety of the government is a puppet shadow government that you got to disobey everything else. You disobey the law that they're giving you, right? So if all of a sudden the American government says, hey, everyone must abort their first kid, that's no different than what happened back with Pharaoh when Moses was put in the basket too. They said, hey, every firstborn, or King Herod in the New Testament said the same thing. Christians do have no obligation to obey that. In fact, they have an obligation to rebel against that, not to rebel against the government, but to rebel against that ordinance or that law that they're trying to put out, because that's an unlawful order, because it violates God's law. Does that make sense? That's a ton, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that sounds very clear, but then in 2020, it felt more nuanced, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. When you're talking about things that don't protect human life, like one of the things that I've been racking my brain over, and I talk a lot about on this channel, is like socialism, communism, Marxism. And I'm wondering, I've asked my father-in-law, who's also a pastor, like, what is my command as a Christian? Because I know that those are untrue. I know that those lead to evil and human suffering. But you could have a law on the way to socialism. It doesn't just turn overnight. That it doesn't violate a biblical principle, but it leads to human suffering. And I'll give you an example. Like we'll take the jab. I didn't know if it was. I didn't really have a biblical stance on it. I didn't use the Bible as like, I want to take it or I don't want to take it. All I knew is that I was at least being lied to, right? That it didn't make sense. And so there was a part of me, I was like, well, government's telling me to do something. And people would quote Romans 13. I'm like, so if the government told you to pat your head and rub your belly every time you enter a grocery store, are we supposed to do it? Like, where is our line with arbitrary things where trust tends to break down, if that makes sense? So they've lied to you over and over, and they're telling you something that's not to do something that's not starkly black and white unbiblical. But since they've lied to you so many times, you start to wonder what their motivation is and if it leads to human suffering. I hope I'm making sense here, but
yeah,
there's degrees to this. I feel like where A doesn't always lead to Z, like mandatory vaccines doesn't lead to total totalitarianism, but it does lead to B, which eventually leads to C. And then if you keep going on that path and you never put your foot in the ground, it leads to massive human suffering, as history has taught us. So I would say conscience to some degree plays a role, but where do you draw that line where you're like, this action by government is a path that we don't want to walk down, and it's not necessarily unbiblical, but it will lead to something that's very unbiblical? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't. I think that's why Christians need to get into the political sphere. That's why Christians need to, I mean, if you look at the demographic and the statistics for Christians that go to the polls to vote, it's sad how little Christians actually go and let their voices be heard. I mean, that's the whole great thing about our country is that, we're a democracy. We can vote people in and vote people out, is that our voices can be heard, but we need to go to the polls to enact that. So, let's just say step A is ongoing, and Christians around the U.S. and even non-Christians who don't like that, they should make their voice known by electing officials that will uphold their values and their views from that specific geographical region. But what I would say too, though, to answer that question is that, if the order of the command is like it's arbitrary and it doesn't violate scripture, I mean, I think you got to draw a clear line. Otherwise, there's always this gray. And I don't like the gray because I used to camp out in the gray all the time. And I know you did too. Is like you've got to be very black and white clear on this. And so the thing is if it does not violate God's law and it's not commanding us to do something that God forbids or forbidding us to do something that God commands, I'm going to adhere to that. I'll give you an example. So it's been double red flag here, meaning you can't enter into the water here in the Gulf unless you've got, a surfboard attached to you. Well, we were having a beach worship service last night in which we needed to do a baptism, but it's double red flag. So we had the question of like, okay, I mean, we're not going in and swimming. So you could kind of see it as gray and like, we're just going up to our knees, do a quick dunk and call it a day. But the thing is like, no, I'm disobeying that law, whether it's overtly disobeying that law or subvertly, because the double red flag means you're not to go in there. And someone say, yeah, it's not to go in there to swim. Well, I get that too, but we as Christians are supposed to live above reproach and not give anybody reasons to doubt like why and how we are living and conducting our lives. So when all else fails, err on the side of safety and not safety in the physical sense, but safety in the obeying the sense and making sure you're not violating God's law by obeying it. I mean, was it annoying to not be able to do it? Sure. But at the same time, we're obeying the laws of the people put over us and honestly, that law is specifically to protect human life. At the outset with the jab, was the intention to save lives? I don't know. I think it's potentially somewhat otherwise that I think it was more political than it was anything. But again, I mean, I think when it comes down to that, you've got to look at your liberty, your Christian liberty and ask and, pray and see if you've got a peace about it and you're like, yeah, this isn't violating scripture. This isn't violating that. I prayed about it. I don't feel very strongly against it. So then obey the government. But again, that's not that Christians need to be just laissez-faire sitting in the back and like, I'm not going to really advocate. I'm not going to really do this and this. We are called to do that and we must be doing that. And I love that there's more conservative Christians getting into the political sphere. And we honestly need more and more of those if we ever wish to reform America back into some semblance of Christian ethics or morality or whatever. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does. Okay. And I don't think not everything in life you're going to have a light bulb epiphany moment, but that has been my confusion in the last couple of years. Cause people would just quote Romans 13 and I'm like, I don't know if it's just my head telling my heart, my conscience, like this seems off, but there's multiple times the last couple of years. And I'll give you a good example. And another one of my questions is we live in a unique political sphere where we both have been in the military and we swore an oath, not to the president, not to a king, but to the Constitution, which is a document that in our political sphere is superior and governs their actions. And so if you violate under that political sphere, the Constitution, illegally as a person in power, how do you square that circle as a person in America's political sphere where Constitution, president violates it or somebody violates it or asks you to do so? Do you take that into account when it comes to government? Because our government structure is mildly different than other people's government structure.
Yeah, I think you need to. I actually had this conversation with one of the elders from our church about that exact question, because we're a constitutional state. We have a Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence. So like that is now what is governing, or let me say this, should be governing our country. And so if the leaders are violating the Constitution that they had swore an oath to fulfill, and they're no longer fulfilling that, then I think that shifts the conversation a bit. I don't think that it needs to necessarily go right to taking up physical arms and, blowing places, but I think that there's more peaceful opportunities and ways of doing this. But as we have seen with everything that's going on in the political world right now, is there any kind of justice whatsoever? Is there anyone that's actually doing things the right way accordingly? I mean, when you can indict a former president of the United States and all this other stuff, it's like, it's very like eye-opening of like, what are we doing here? And so I think with that, I think because we are governed by the Constitution, and that is a higher authority of governance than just the president is supposed to be enacting. The people give the president the power. The Constitution is what dictates and delineates how that power is supposed to operate. So if it's in conjunction with that standard that has been orchestrated, granted, it's not the Bible, but that's the standard to which he or she or whomever it is supposed to be held accountable. They need to be held accountable by that. And the way in which they should be held accountable by that is by our Congress, the Senate, and everything else, to make sure that, again, we place godly men and women in those locations so that we can enforce that. And I think it can and should be enforced. But I would say taking up arms would probably be, if at all, the very last solution whatsoever. So I think that's kind of the answer to that, because the Constitution is what dictates and governs. That's the standard to which they're being held accountable. And if they're not being held to that standard, how can they expect everyone else to be held to the same standard if they're not themselves being held to that standard? And that's just poor leadership, modeling what you expect other people to follow. And if you're not modeling that, what kind of a leader are you?
I think, one of the examples I use on my channel a lot is, number one, and I advocate the same, like the Constitution is not a panacea. And I think it was John Adams who said the Constitution relies on a moral people. And so if we don't have a revival in this country, me and you both serving in the military, I asked the question, if you could sell secrets and make money and know you could get away with it, what is the muscle? What is the intestinal fortitude that stops you from doing that, from profiting off of being disloyal? And it is loyalty. It is patriotism. It is something that is moral inside of you that isn't just about, getting rich and just you. And if we have a constitutional republic with immoral people in charge, it's not like this document's going to stop them from doing that, both in the military and outside the military. If you have an immoral people that don't have a moral compass other than power and control, Constitution is just a worthless document.
Well, I mean, think about it too, man, is our culture is inherently immoral as well. So, I mean, we're being led by immoral people, being voted on by immoral people, which will lead to immoral results. So I think the conversation that we're having is like, how do Christians live in an immoral society and continue to live in an immoral society? And the one that I've often heard people talk about is like, we need a physical revolution of taking up arms and overthrowing the government. And I'm like, dude, I can totally see that. And like the warrior side of me is like, let's go, baby. But then the other side of that's holding me in check is the scriptures that ultimately I know God's in control of this. And like in my article, what I reference is that Munzer thought that he had received divine revelation, a vision, if you will, that he was supposed to go and do this. And so he thought that, hey, I need to go ahead and, and go into this. And Luther saying, no, that's not what's happening. Because if you look at this, and like what Munzer did was that his ideology that dictated why he was doing that was more dictated by his selfish ambitions and what he could physically gain rather than upholding a biblical law. And so I think a lot of times when people are talking about, well, let's take up arms and this and that, to what end? You want to, we've seen America do this in other countries. You want to replace one dictator with another. It's not until that society can get reformed that any kind of positive traction could ever move forward. But we know that not every culture is going to get reformed. We know that not everyone is going to become a Christian, nor should we assume that everyone is going to be, nor should we project that everyone is going to be. So the question is how can Christians and how should Christians live amongst a pagan, idealistic, and, if you will, perverse society? Well, I think it's very clear. I mean, we have all of church history to look at this, man. I mean, again, go back to like at the beginning when I was saying like for 250 years, Christians were in persecution. So dude, systematically pastors were getting taken out one by one by one. So the Roman Empire thought, okay, if we can take out the pastors, the church will fall away. Well, no, because we know what forced multiplication is within the church. for any one pastor you take out, if they're doing their job right, there's going to be 2 to 3 more that'll step up and be able to continue the legacy of Christ onward. So the problem is that for a lot of people who aren't in Christ, and sadly some Christians as well, is they think that the here now is all that there is. But we know that this is not all that there is. This is but a transitory point for us in which we know the end game. We know what the Bible says at the end is that Christ wins, he will be victorious, and we will reign with him in heaven, and we will be in our glorified body. So that really comes down to the mindset. Like, if all you think is that this right here, like your life right now, you know, the average age expectancy, I want to say, is 70. So it's gone up slightly. It went up from like 65 or 60 to 70. I think it continues to go up. I might be wrong on that exact age. But, okay, you've got 70 years on this earth. What are you trying to accomplish here? Like, are you just trying to make life as, like, and I think that's what's so funny too about like people with finances and money and stuff like that. It's like, okay, so you earn a bunch of money. This is why I love the book of Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes just rips this right out from underneath you. It's like, okay, you work hard, so you earn money. All right, you get a lot of money, you earn a lot of money, and then now what? You're wanting more. And so, okay, I want to leave a legacy. So you give birth to kids, you have a son. All right, you want to leave him a big inheritance, but we know that some kids are going to squander that inheritance. So then all that stuff that you work for is going to go for nothing. Okay, so then you don't give it to them. So then what? Well, then I die, my money dies with me, you know, and I'm leaving absolutely nothing on this earth. So, you know, what you've come here with is what you'll leave here with, nothing. So if your mindset is like, I'm going to build the biggest, fattest nest egg I possibly can. I'm going to make billions and millions of dollars. I mean, mortality for everyone is only but a breath away. I mean, look at that submarine that just got, you know, I still don't think they found them. I mean, these are billionaires, dude. Like with billions of dollars, you'd think like they'd have, you know, the ability to, you know, almost be immortal of, you know, with health and this and that. But when God wants, when your time's up, you're gone. There ain't nothing you can do. We all have this destiny end times date, if you will, for each one of us whenever we're going to punch it. And that's the thing, is like, what are you doing now to prepare yourself for eternity? Because this is just but a blip on a map, right? The Bible says life is but a vapor, it's quickly vanishing away. So with all that to say, apply that same logic then into government. Apply that same logic into where you're living. Is, you know, do I want to be under an oppressive regime? No. You know, now someone asks me this, and now this is where I'll change up the subject. Well, Ethan, what if someone, you know, a foreign power invades America and they establish a government? Would you take up arms? Oh, 100% I'm taking up arms. I'm going to fight tooth and nail to protect my family and our way of life that we have here in America, because they violated God's law by taking human life. And so, you know, this is where I would say that does not meet the qualifications of a just war, which is the earlier qualifications I gave about protecting human sanctity, human life. They've actually become the part of the aggressor, violating God's divine law. And so then I would say, yeah, Christians, take up arms. Someone's coming in here to invade this country. Someone's trying to establish, you know, antithetical view that we have as, you know, Americans, that we have as human rights, like not human rights, but human life protectors. That's different, because I'm going to not be offensive. I'm going to be defensive and protect what I have here, protect my wife, my kids, whatever else. So that's where there's going to be a slight subtle shift then as to, you know, a foreign entity coming in to establish their governments over top of us, but they've done so at the cost of violating scripture, to which that is now a unqualified, if you will, government that I'm not going to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, would you say that with that being said, the American Revolution, which was offensive, was unbiblical?
So that's a really good question. And that's one I can see both angles, because the difference is that they had no representation in the states. Like, they had the governors and stuff like that, but they weren't truly governmental actors. You know, King George and what he was doing, you know, there was no representation on behalf of those colonies, and there was no representation on behalf of the constituents, if you will, that lived in America at that time, that would have allowed them a voice, or at least had a direct oversight of government. So I would say what happened in America was not even truly a government that was established in America. So it was more of these, like, imagine, if you will, Eric, I think this might make sense and puts some items in perspective. why are we surprised when we invaded Afghanistan that the Taliban was revolting against us? Because we were the foreign actor. We came into Afghanistan, and then if we now try to assert democracy in a foreign state where democracy has never worked, right? Follow this logic with me then. Okay, if the Taliban's rebelling against the foreign power or the troops that are there, does that mean they're rebelling against America as a whole or the troops that are on that country? And so that's where, I mean, someone may say, you're splitting hairs. Yeah, and you got to make distinctions. And it's not necessarily the same thing because they came over, you know, when you look back about why America was founded and everything else, and you look back again at church history and the English Reformation and who truly came over to America, it was the Pilgrims and it was the Puritans. That was a primary large. I mean, if you look at Plymouth, Massachusetts, so these were individuals where the Pilgrims wanted nothing more to do with the government. So they just left. The Puritans wanted to try and they attempted to reform the government. I mean, if you look at the history of the Tudors, I mean, that's a jacked up history of Henry VIII and then his kids and Bloody Mary and Elizabeth and, I just thought Charles, I can't remember. Yeah. Anyway, Edward. And then you look at that, the Puritans tried the reform. It's not going to work. They come to this brand new country, established, you know, their, if you will, governments. And then Britain came over, since all of them were coming from Britain, like, we're going to establish trade posts and everything else here. There's really no legislation there that gave them a voice. So really, I don't see that and what had happened in America as actually being a true government, actually being falling under the qualifications of Romans 13. Now, I could also potentially argue for the other way, saying, no, it was, even though it was distant away, they still did have a government authority over top of them. But I would say that could be debatable, but that's where I fall on that. So no, I think that was not necessarily a rebellion. That was more of an armed reformation to get this country what the whole country was supposed to be in the first place. Because the whole reason they left was to because if you look at that history from Henry VIII, when he broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Anglican Church, which essentially all he wanted to do is take the power that the Pope had over what he could or could not do. That was when the church was kind of running the state. Because if the Pope excommunicated the leader or the king, that makes basically, I mean, that's the problem with the Catholic Church, is that then makes their baptisms ineffective. That now means that any salvation, if you will, treasury of merit, all that stuff is gone. And so that's kind of what happened with that. And so it was inhospitable for Protestants. And so Protestants were getting martyred and executed. And then the same thing kind of happened back and forth. And they're like, we just need a country where you can worship whomever you wish to worship without fear of being killed, which is, again, in alignment with the biblical qualifications of not taking human life.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a question, you know, as I get older, you start to think like, being a soldier is a young man's game, I think, to a certain extent, because there is a certain amount of naivete to young men. And as you get older, you start to question the morals of what you've done and why you were there, etc. So when it comes to military power, that's another good question. I was talking with my father-in-law the other day. It's like, when is it immoral? Because if you're asked to do an immoral thing, that's pretty obvious. But there are people think there's killing that is moral in war, for one reason or another. But typically that reason is moral because you're being told what that reason is, whether that you were the German soldiers in World War II, the American soldiers in Iraq, you were told you are in the long run protecting American citizens. So where do you draw that line, being a former military guy, where you think, hey, this is an unjust person ordering me to do a just thing, but they've lied about those things so many times that I don't know if what I'm actually doing is just. I know that can get very nuanced, but when you say unjust taking of human life, where do you draw that line?
So yeah, let me address the first thing is, so what we don't want to be doing is the ad hominem fallacy, is discrediting the truth of a matter because of the person who has declared the truth. Like, you could have the worst person in history say the sky is blue, and it's a fact. Yes, the sky is in fact blue, but the person is a complete dirtbag. Doesn't mean that what he said is not true. So I can't discount what he said because of who the person is, right?
Right.
So the good thing is, in the military, I mean, we have the law of armed conflict. So we have LOAC, and then we have Geneva Convention. So what I like about the LOAC is that if, you know, and it's even in the oath, is to obey the lawful orders of those appointed over to me. Okay, well, what's the laws? Well, then you need to know what LOAC is. And there's 4 basic principles of LOAC. The first being military necessity, like, is this objective or is this target of military necessity to achieve a legitimate military objective, right? So that would make sense. Hey, we need you to go blow up this orphanage. That's not a military necessity. How and what way is that good, right? So that immediately can start to set up some, if you will, start to erect the fence. That's the first principle. The second one is the humanity. We only need to do enough force as necessary to subdue the other actor and prohibiting him to cease efforts, because the quicker you can end the war, the less loss of civilian casualties and everything else that there is, and the collateral damage. Then the third one is proportionality, which kind of goes hand in hand, is the loss of life and damage of the property and to the property is incidental to the tax, must not be gained in excessive relation to concrete and direct military advantage expected to be gained, right? So I only need to do which is very tough to even really think about, like, how do we even plan that out? I don't know. That's why I'm glad I was never a commander or anything else like that. It's like, you only need to do enough bombing necessary to take that objective, right? You only need to kill enough enemy troops to sway their desire to continue to want to fight so that they can surrender, right? That's why we have prisoners of war. If you just come in there and they surrender and you just schwack everybody who's surrendering, you're violating LOAC and you're violating the laws. And that is an unjust thing that you're doing for potentially a just cause. And then number 4, the fourth basic principle of the LOAC is chivalry. In order to respect for and the protection of the civilian population, you must keep the civilian population apart from the combatant. So you have the combatant and then you have a non-combatant. You're not going to be doing combatant action on a village that you know for a fact has no combatants in it, right? That is not of military necessity. That is not purporting and protecting the humanity, and that's not following the proportionality. So when you look at that, that is how you kind of weigh this. Is you've got to weigh this all out, is to, well, okay, what's the law? Is this a lawful order? And if you're in the military and your commander is giving you an unlawful order, it's your right and responsibility to disobey that lawful order, which sounds a lot like what we were talking about Romans 13, about doing something that the LOAC forbids, or they're commanding, or they're forbidding us to do something that the LOAC tells us to. Same thing with the scriptures. They're forbidding us to do something God commands, or commanding us to do something that God forbids. The LOAC, the GCs, the Geneva Conventions, that holds like military conflict in, I guess you could say, in these left and right parameters in which we can gauge and assess, is this lawful or is this not?
Sure. Yeah, I know there's a lot of guys in the military that have, I'd say, like a moral injury from their time in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they felt like people died for nothing, and they didn't know that they don't necessarily feel a moral injury for what they did because of what they were ordered to do, but it was, they didn't know what winning was. They didn't know what America's objective was, and although they were following the LOAC, they still felt lied to after the fact, that what they were doing over there wasn't actually the reason they were told they were over there, wasn't the reason they were over there. And a lot of people I know have, including myself, have kind of a moral injury from that conflict, because, and a lot of people from Vietnam have the same one, because they don't know, they never knew what winning looked like, and they thought it was just all for nothing, which to a certain degree war is. But that was like my moral question about war, because when I agree with the ad hominem attack, but if somebody authority, you start to not trust them depending on how many times they've lied to you. And when you start to ask questions and it's not obvious what the objective or winning looks like, you go, I wonder if they're lying to me again. And that, I guess that gets into your own personal conscience. So.
Well, what I would say too, especially with that, is like, you only can do with what you know to be the information at the time, right. And you and I were never in a position of making policy. There is an expectancy, and there's hopefully an accountability of those who are in their positions, even though we know not everybody in the position ought to be in the position that they're at. But there must be a level of trust, because the same way in which I apply this from the pastor level down into like the commander sphere is that those people who are in charge, who have been given the authority, even the commander, even the whomever it is deciding that, God has allowed them to be in that position, and they're going to be held to a higher standard than the average Joe, the average grunt, the average NCO, right?
Mm-hmm.
So pastors are held to a different standard than that of the congregation. Why? It's because I will be held accountable. And James 3 talks about this. Not many of you should become teachers because you're going to be held to a stricter standard, because I will be held accountable. Like, we're all the same. I'm not different or better because I'm a pastor. I'm held to a higher standard, if you will. And it's more dangerous for me if I'm not teaching something that I need to be teaching, or I'm teaching something that I should not be teaching, the people of God from the scriptures. And so that's how I view this, is because if there's people in churches today that are being taught bad theology, poor theology, and they should be studying the Bible to know that that is not right or that is incorrect. And so there's a level of, if you will, guilt, not guilt, but there's a level of responsibility for those individuals to know what it is that is wrong and what it is that is right. Now, when you're talking about like a large military objective, like why are we in Afghanistan, or why are we in Iraq, or why are we doing any of this? Hey, all that I know is my specific job. I'm going to do my specific job to the glory and to the best of my ability for God. And I'm going to do it as best as I can. And then if I am commanded to do something that is in violation of the law, I'm not going to do it. But other than that, I'm not saying it's a plea for ignorance, but it's a plea for, like, one, even if you wanted to get access to the information as to the large objective, you're not going to get it ever. And so that's when you just have to trust, hey, they're going to be held accountable, because ultimately justice is going to be the Lord's. And so I can't project that onto myself. I know that one way or another, those people who made those right or wrong decisions, those good or unjust wars or anything else like that, they're going to ultimately have to give an account to that. And that's way more of a scary account than what I would ever care to want to give here on this earth. And so that's how I would do that. Is a lot, I've talked to a lot of guys who, have shame or whatever that they did over there. And I said, look, man, you did what you had to do because of the situation you were at. You were protecting the guy and the girl to the left and to the right of you. And as long as you did not violate any of these laws, you've done nothing wrong. Now, the hardest thing, though, is it's the psychotherapy of working through in your mind and your mentality of like, well, this was your human life and this is not, but you were obeying the lawful orders of those appointed over to you. You took that oath, like that is what you're supposed to do. That was what was required of you. Because in one instance, if you didn't do it and, you're overseas and you're getting shot at, but you're like, I don't want to take that other life. And by you not shooting back, you now potentially were the cause of that guy or girl to the left or to the right of you for them to get killed because you were not upholding your end of your moral responsibility for the position that you were in.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my two cents on that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think kind of circling back to what you're saying earlier, like your life is but a blip. And like sometimes probably my biggest struggle is people struggle with all kinds of things, but mine is I put responsibility on my shoulders that isn't necessarily mine. And my biggest, walking the line between trusting the Lord, and apathy has been the biggest struggle of my life, because I definitely lean towards not trusting God. Like it's all my responsibility. I got to figure this out, because I know, like, the way I think about it, and I know this isn't true, but the way I think about it is, well, you can take a right or a left, and if you take a left, then this happens. If you take a right, this happens, whether that be financially, with your family, etc. And I think that God's going to be behind there, like, oh, wrong direction, and hit me with a club or whatnot. So I've always struggled with where my responsibility ends and trust begins. And to a certain extent, I still don't have an answer to that, because I feel like, I talk a lot about finances on my channel, and finance is math. And you can make a good mathematical decision or a bad one, a good probable decision or a bad one. And that's kind of how I look at a lot of things in life. And I know that that's wrong, because I lean towards trusting myself rather than the Lord. But how would you, for a guy like me who struggles, I think a lot of men struggle with that. Like, hey, I'm a man, I got to do this, I have these responsibilities, and if I don't do this, then this is going to fail. I think a lot of men struggle with trusting in the Lord because of that reason. And I think they're going to be apathetic. If they trust God, then that means they'll be apathetic. How would you talk to a guy like me in that realm where that's your struggle? Like, where do you draw that line between where your responsibility ends?
I mean, you're always responsible. And the thing that I'll say is that the biggest thing as us as men, if you're a Christian, is like to fulfill what biblical manhood is, right? Like to be doing what you need to be doing as a Christian. And so Genesis gives us this biblical mandate of like, we are to have dominion over the earth, to subdue the earth. We are supposed to lead our children, lead our wives. 1 Corinthians 11 gives a beautiful example that man was created in the image of God. Woman was created in the image of God. Man was created for the glory of God. Woman was created for the glory of man. So our purpose as men is to lead our families, to lead our wives, to protect our wives, to care for our families, to care for our wives, to care for our kids, to spend time. But we do this by our prioritization. So first off, I have to prioritize my time with God and my knowing of his scriptures, and by reading them and praying. And then once I've got that, then I need to prioritize my wife. I have to prioritize my wife. Then after that, I prioritize my kids. And then after that, then I will be working on my job. The difference is that a lot of times we prioritize those lists out of whack. We put our decision-making, job-making at the forefront, and we put everything else on the back front. And when you're putting what your desires are first, and you're not even seeking God's will, like, hey, is this what you want me to do? You're just doing something like, well, I've got option A and I've got option B. Which option should I do? Have you prayed about it? Have you sought the scriptures? Like, where did this desire come from? Is this naturally what God has kind of gifted you into? Or is this more so of like you doing this of your own accord? Because I think there's many times that we can make situations seem as if there is only an A or a B. But sometimes there's like an A through F, or there's 10 different decisions. I mean, I'll give you an example. It was 2011. I wanted to get out of the military. I wanted to be a cop. So I applied at Contra Costa Sheriff's Department down in Fairfield, California. I was down in there, and I passed the test. I went through the process, passed a background check, and I was waiting for my start date. And I was about to drop papers to separate from the Air Force and to go to be a sheriff. Well, at that point in time, that's when California kind of went bankrupt and lost all of their funding for paying for people to go through the academy. And so clearly that door shut. Now, here's the thing. I could have pushed through and done it, but I would have had to take that financial burden on myself. And so my priority was, I had prayed about it. I kind of had a piece about it. But then the second thing was like, okay, I got to take care of my wife. I got to take care of my kids. Okay, I don't have a job to be able to do the first two. I can still maintain the one of like praying about this. But then when I thought about it, I'm like, okay, if God is really wanting me to do this, he's not going to put me into a position where I'm going to be a poor steward with what he has blessed me with of my wife and kids. So I realized, okay, that's not going to be the case. So I didn't do that. So then I applied to legitimately 62 other jobs around the US to be a cop. The only one that came back was Baltimore, Maryland. I'm not working there. I flew there, I interviewed, I did all that. And then I saw the city. I'm like, nope, this ain't happening. But again, I could have pursued with that. I could have pushed forward with that, but I believe that I would have been going against like the natural step of where God is wanting me to go with this. So the biggest thing when it's deciding about trusting in God and then being apathetic, it's like God is sovereign, God is providential. He's going to take care of us, but we must be putting in that effort too of studying his word, knowing what he says, praying about it, and seeking his will on it. And the biggest way in which I've seen this happen, it can happen in different people's lives, is, if I have a big decision to make, I talked to my wife about it. Hey, let's take a couple of days. Let's pray through this. And then let's talk through this. So I separate, she separates, like mentally of where we're praying, not discussing it for a couple of days. And we could both come back together and be like, all right, what do you feel like God is saying? What do you feel like? And we discuss it. And then it becomes very clear, like the right direction to take or what direction not to take. Or sometimes it's not that clear. And in that case, you just have to make the decision and walk through that decision and pray that it's the right one. Because sometimes I believe that God gives us multiple opportunities to step through those doors, and all three seem good. All three seem right. And you could see yourself at all three and you don't have any major issues about any of them. You just got to make a decision and own that decision. and then go through it and then just see what happens. And if it doesn't go exactly the way that you wanted it to go, God can still use that, and then he'll move you somewhere else. So you just can't be lazy. You must always be looking to protect and to take care of your family. I mean, dude, I used to serve pizzas when I first was in the military, when I got married, to be able to afford an engagement ring for my wife. So the most embarrassing thing was being done teaching classes, and I'd go over to Rosa's Pizza and I'd deliver pizzas to students that I just taught, and stuff like that. So like, you got to take the steps of being a man to provide for your family, whatever the cost, whatever it takes, and then own that decision. Whether it's a good, bad, or indifferent decision, make the decision, own the decision, and then be willing to adjust and admit your faults. But by no means are you to be lazy about it. I think the laziest thing is to do nothing, and that's what most men do.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer. I think normally people who ask that question like I just did, you should follow up like you just did. Are you reading your Bible? Are you praying about it? That's probably half of the time it's the last thing I do. It's weighing the options, pros and cons, and not consulting God. And I think in today's world where, you have these big moral dilemmas that we've talked about today, wisdom comes from the Lord and fear the Lord. And if you're not consulting him, then what do you expect? Well, Ethan, I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you all day, but dude, this is really enlightening to me. And I think, one key takeaway I think people should have, especially people that are Christians that watch my channel, is there is no panacea. It's not the Constitution. It's not capitalism. It is a revival and serving the Lord that's going to change this country if you think it needs to change for the positive, which I do. And as we wrestle through these questions, I think in the priority stack, like Ethan was talking about, it's God, your family, your kids, your wife, and then filter it through that. I think is a good lesson to take away. Anything to add?
No, man, that was good. I just think these are questions and thoughts that every person needs to kind of go through, and not use your opinion or use the opinion of someone else, but go to some standard of truth, which for us as Christians, it's the Bible, and then develop your own stance using biblical support for that. So just don't take my stance for it, like, oh, that kind of sounds convincing.
Sure.
Now, forget that mess, dude. Like, you need to figure it out for yourself and put in the time and the work and the effort to make sure, like, because if you're talking about, how you're living your life. This is a worldview. How are you going to live your life? How you conduct yourself? Do you have principles? Do you have lines that you will or will not cross? Because if you don't have principles, you don't have lines, you've never articulated them or even thought them in your head, I don't know what kind of a person you are.
Right.
So don't adopt someone else's view just because it sounds good. Go to the sources, right?
Yep.
Go to the primary sources, research it, study it yourself, and then come up with a reasonable understanding of why you believe what you believe, why you've gone that direction, or why you haven't gone that direction. And then what else can you do? I mean, you can't really do anything else. At least in your mind, you're justified in what you're doing and how you're doing it. But yeah, that's all I got.
Amen to that. Thanks for coming on, brother. I hope to have you on again, and I'll keep you around before we end the show. And for the viewers, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.